Hi, in this session, I'm going to talk to you about descriptive research. There are three kinds or designs for gathering primary data: exploratory research, descriptive research, and causal research. While exploratory research is marked by flexibility and a loosely structured design, in descriptive research, the design is more rigid and there's less room for flexibility. The reason being, at this point, the problem is fairly well defined and hypotheses are clearly laid out, as opposed to in the case of exploratory research. Descriptive research is by far the most widely used form of the three ways of gathering primary data. In this session, we'll look at the purpose of descriptive research, and then look at the two kinds of designs for descriptive research: longitudinal and cross-sectional. Descriptive research is designed to describe the characteristics of interest. In our case, these include consumers or salespersons or folks working within a company like employees. The goal here is to measure things such as amount of a product a consumer or group consumes, or their attitudes. It may also be used to gauge perceptions of a product, or to figure out the degree to which various marketing variables are linked to each other, and finally to make specific predictions. Broadly speaking, you can think about two descriptive research designs: longitudinal and cross-sectional. One way to think about these two designs is that cross-sectional designs, as the name suggests, involve gathering data at one point in time, let's say T1. On the other hand, with the longitudinal design, data is gathered at many points in time, typically from the same customer, same set of people. I say typically because over time, as you see, the bubble for T1 is larger than the one for T2. What happens in practice is, in a design where you gather data over a span of time, people may fall out of the sample. For example, if data was gathered at time T1 for a sample of 1,000 people, at time T2, not all 1,000 people may be available. They may have moved. Therefore, they may not be available, or their contact information might have changed, or they may have just perished. And so for these reasons, with longitudinal designs, you'll see that as time goes along, attrition might reduce the sample size, and replacements may have to be called in to fill up the gap. Cross-section designs are by far the more widely used of the descriptive research designs. In this, data is gathered from a given sample only once. There are, of course, times when you want to know about how things change over time. The solution utilized by cross-sectional researchers is to track change over time by examining cohorts. We'll look at that shortly. In a longitudinal design, the same sample is gauged over time repeatedly. A great example of this is the Framingham Heart Study. It has nothing to do with business, yet a great example. Many years ago, the town of Framingham in Massachusetts was selected as a town that'll be examined, where they would track the health behavior, dietary habits, exercise habits, and work habits of all the people in that small town in Massachusetts. Over a span of about 10 or so years, every I believe month or so, people would keep a diary panel tracking what they would eat, what they would do for exercise, and if they have any vices like smoking, let's say, they would keep track of that as well. And every couple of months, these people were also measured or examined by a doctor. This gave researchers access to a long period of time where they had information about people's health status, as well as their diet, exercise behaviors, and work behaviors. Thanks to this great study, we're now able to identify more clearly the reasons for heart disease. Of course, in the world of business, we oftentimes look at, we track things that are relevant to business, such as examining changing people's attitudes towards a brand, a product, and consumption habits over time. There are two kinds of panels, broadly speaking. There are true panels and omnibus panels. A true panel, like the ones used by Nielsen, for example, involves tracking an individual over time with the same set of questions. The person signing up for Nielsen's purchase panel would share information with Nielsen about what they shop at a store every time they go to a store. So over time, they're answering the same questions, in this case, about what they're shopping for or what they're buying. In the case of a media panel, those panelists would share information about their media consumption behavior. This was in the past done by a small set-top box linked to people's cable boxes that would track what shows people are watching on TV, how long they're watching it for, and so on. In both these cases, the same data is gleaned from the panel over a long period of time. An omnibus panel is one where there is a panel that might be given different sets of questions over time. So for example, the panel may today be asked about their recycling behavior, and tomorrow be asked about their consumption of pizza. With longitudinal designs, we typically get data that varies over time. A great example is the University of Michigan Consumer Sentiment Index. This index tracks how people feel about the economy over time. Every month, people respond to a survey indicating how they're feeling. And over time, we can learn about periods when people's feelings or sentiments were down versus up. Many people analyzing financial markets take into consideration consumer sentiment, as it is often a leading indicator of financial markets. Here's another interesting one. If you're ever curious about the kind of flavor people like for jams, jellies, and preserves, well, MRI-Simmons gathers some data on this, and we can learn that over time, over the last 10 years or so, the preference for the flavor most preferred has been strawberry, and that hasn't changed much over time. Grape comes in number 2, raspberry number 3. We can see these trends are fairly consistent over the last 10 years or so of time. So with longitudinal designs, we ask the same people the same question over a span of time, which means this is a very robust design. Another benefit of polling people over time is we can learn about interesting things like their changes in their preferences for brands. Here is some data on the purchase behavior of brands A, B, C, and D over times T1 and T2. From this little matrix, we can see that brand A purchase went up from 200 to 250, while brands B and C experienced declining sales, and D stayed about the same. When you just look at this table, you might believe that brand A has benefited at the expense of brands B and C. Now, because we have data available on time, you can examine the same bit of data with more granularity. Let's examine then a brand switching matrix, which, by the way, is the same information as this table here. but a bit more detailed than this one. So the following table then shows us what brand was bought at time T1 and at time T2. So now we have a larger matrix here, including purchases of A, B, C, and D at times T1 and T2, and showing you the transition. From this matrix, it's probably obvious to you that brand A had a loyal consumer base, 175 out of 200 of people who bought, sorry, say that again, 175 out of the 200 people that bought brand A at time T1 also bought it at time T2. In other words, 175 out of 200 have remained loyal to brand A. We can also see out here that of 25 out of those 200 people that bought brand A at time T1 have switched to brand B. As you examine this, panel, you'll learn that while brand A we know has benefited in that the purchase of brand A at time T1 was 200, at time T2 is 250, you wonder, how has brand A gained? Well, brand A benefited from taking away sales not from C, B, or C, rather from D. And so brand A has taken away market share from brand D, which led it to grow to 250 units in sales. We can also learn from this matrix by examining an index. We can look at the level of loyalty each brand has. If you divide this number here by the total purchase in time T1, you can learn about what is the loyalty one has towards each brand. Let's take a look at that then. We'll look at fractions dividing the numbers highlighted. The next slide, we draw this comparison, create those fractions, and you can see already here that brand A has a loyalty index of 0.875. Brand B, 0.75, and so on. So we can learn a little bit here about how loyal people are towards each brand by looking at the brand switching matrix. Moving along, those using cross-sectional designs often want to derive the same benefits of examining change over time. But since they don't have the luxury of tracking an individual over time like one could using a consumer panel, they use as a proxy cohorts. Here's an example of this. In this particular picture, you can see that we have a cohort called C5. Well, in 1990, they would have been aged 10 to 19. Well, 10 years later, they'd be older. Another 10 years later, even older, and so on. So basically, you can track a group of people over time or track a cohort over time. The cohort C5 as such comprises of a sample of people that fit that cohort, the cohort which is born between 1971 and 1980. By doing such cohort analysis, one can derive some interesting insights. Take, for example, life insurance. You would expect somebody who's younger wouldn't care so much about getting life insurance because they don't envision dying anytime soon. On the other hand, one would intuit as somebody gets older, they're more likely to care about insurance products in general. Here's some data that includes information about the percentage of people buying life insurance. It was gathered using a cohort study. We can learn out here then that as you follow this cohort C5, over time, more and more people are buying insurance. Of course, it's the same cohort. As you look at different cohorts and put it all together, you can learn there's a tipping point here. When people cross 29, the amount of insurance, the percentage of people buying insurance increases manyfold. And then there's a more gradual increase thereafter. To wrap it up then, longitudinal design have the benefit of detecting change over time and tracking the same people, which means there's less room for other explanations if you're tracking the same people over time. We're able to gather a large amount of data and more reliable and arguably more accurate data from a longitudinal design versus a cross-sectional design. The downside, of course, with longitudinal designs is that it is really difficult to get representative sampling. There's always room for response bias because over time, you might have people dropping off from the survey panel. And the replacements are not exactly the same people anymore, so now you've got like a biased sample. There's also the concern that people who join a survey panel do it to benefit from incentives of the panel. Therefore, they are people who are not typical. I mean, somebody who joins a Nielsen purchase panel may be doing it to benefit from free coupons they get from Nielsen. Well, if that's the case, then they're not as committed to, well, they're not typical in the sense that they're only doing it to get the freebies or incentives. And they're systematically different from people who don't care about the incentives offered to participate in the panel. To wrap it up then, in this chapter, we outlined the purpose of descriptive research, and we contrasted longitudinal and cross-sectional designs for gathering descriptive research data. Thank you.